Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Good afternoon, President Althea. John, thank you for the very kind introduction. As mentioned, you always learn something. I will never hear French music again in the same manner. So every time I hear that song, certainly that will be different. As John mentioned, there is another book. I was just here last summer, so I couldn't have messed up too much that you guys invited me back. John said, what else can you come talk about? And I said, do you want 21st century stuff or do you want 19th century? Let's go with the 19th century. So this is the book. I will have some available for sale in the back. We're running out of hard copies. We'll be going to paperback copy soon. And I apologize. John was kind enough to read the entire title. Long title, not my idea. The basic premise of the story is it's a true story, for those of you who weren't here. 75 wartime letters between an Irish immigrant, Captain, 17th Illinois Infantry, and a woman he met in camp in Peoria. True story. So it's basically a Civil War courtship or romance told through 75 letters. I didn't like the title, thought it was too long. Because it's a Civil War courtship romance, my preference was 50 Shades of Blue and Gray. The publisher did not like that idea, and it's probably a good idea. I can imagine how many disappointed people there would be who went to Barnes & Noble and ordered this from Amazon and read the book. Wait, that's not what I thought it was. So we're going to talk a little bit today about something different. As I said, John and I've been talking about this because, as John noted, I've been studying, and I will emphasize, studying the Civil War for 50 years. It's one of these things where I went to Gettysburg as a kid, 11 years old, and kind of went, whatever it is that grabs you. People always want to know, why did you get involved and why did you get interested in this and why? And that really started it. And as noted, I did do a book. I wound up getting these letters from somebody who was getting rid of them, who wanted me to sell them for him. When I saw what it was, I couldn't sell them. I wound up buying the entire collection. I still own the letters. So I wanted to do something a little bit different. So today we're going to talk about, as John said, that the title here is The Largely Unknown. Now, some of you may know about these, but people tend to know the most common things about the war. They know Fort Sumter, where the war started. People know about Gettysburg. As John mentioned, they know a little bit about Appomattox, even though there's a little lesser known history and story of Appomattox we're going to talk a little bit about today. They know about the Lincoln assassination. So people tend to know those things. People know Picketts Charge. They know Little Round Top. We're going to talk about some of the things that over the years have caught my attention. And interestingly, as I looked at these things and I researched them and read about them and crossed over them in books, many of them have strong religious overtones, which we'll talk a little bit about today, too. I want to try and leave a little bit of time for questions. I could hang around a little bit before I go back and get pressed into back into the 21st century side of politics back in Harrisburg. But in many ways, what I've found, these things are not as well known, but in many cases were as important to what happened afterwards and were as important in defining American history as some of the other things that we've talked about here, the Gettysburgs, the Manassas, the assassination, the Mobile Bay, damn the torpedoes, all that stuff that people love, those nice little sound bites. Also keep something else in mind. These are there's nothing in concrete about this. These are the most largely unknown dictated. It's not an act of Congress. This is my idea. This is just simply some things I came up with. And as sitting here today, somebody came up and threw out another one. I went, wish I'd have thought of that one. That's a really good one. So I'm sure that there's others. And if any of you say, hey, how come you didn't write about this? Great idea. These are just things that have occurred to me over the years. And again, a lot of them have religious overtones. And interestingly, most of what I'm going to talk about are not directly related to the battle. We talk a lot about battle, and I know a lot of people say, I'm not interested in the military. To me, I've always been more interested in the human interest side of it, hence the book that I wrote. And a lot of these are more human interest side as well. So let's talk a little bit about some of those. And the first one is one that a lot of people have talked about, which is July 21st, 1861. Now, I know I said Manassas, people tend to know about the first major battle of the war. Of course, many of you are familiar with what happened after. Going into this battle, people in the United States thought this would be literally a 3-month war, depending on which side you were on. If you were in the North, we're going to go down and whip those people. It's going to be over. If you're in the South, same thing. It's going to be a 3-month war. Yankees don't know how to fight. We have all the best generals. We have all the best horses. We have all the best horsemen. Easy. We'll have this knocked out in no time. Both sides thought that. And interestingly, which plays into some other things later, enlisting in the war back in those days was very different than you have today. If you go into the military now, any veterans in here, first, thank you for your service. But when you enlisted, you were sent into an organization, a company, a regiment, etc., where you were next to somebody from Florida, North Carolina, New York. In the Civil War, when you enlisted, the people in this area would enlist together. So you went together as a 100-person company. You were literally in line with your brother, your coworker, your uncle. Your father might be the captain of the company because people didn't need to have military experience back then. So this is what these guys went away for. They went away with 100 people from their community. So at Manassas, each side went out, a disaster for the Union. Absolute disaster for the Union. This was the retreat. Many of you are familiar with the retreat. The people from Washington went out thinking, this is going to be great. We're going to get to see a battle. This is wonderful. It's going to be over soon. We're going to show those Confederates. Well, it didn't quite work out that way. Confederates brought reinforcements in at the end, routed the Union troops. This is a kind of contemporary print of the time which shows the wagons tumbling back. The people from Washington had brought picnic baskets out, literally, and were spread out on hills overlooking the battle when all of a sudden the Confederates routed the Union Army and drove them back. Completely changed the perspective of both sides. And I'd argue, despite the fact that the Confederates won that battle, it might not have been a very good thing for them. Here's why. For the Union, they came out of that chastened. Wow, this isn't going to be as easy as we thought. So there was kind of a renewed effort. Let's make sure, raising more men, generating more war materials. For the Confederates, perhaps it lulled them into a little bit of complacency. This is going to be as easy as we thought. These guys are no match for us. So arguably Manassas, yes, it was the first important battle of the war, the first major land battle of the war, but also lent something to each side. I'd argue one positive and one negative. Next one, keep forgetting about this. Fredericksburg, Virginia. December 13th, 1862. Again, we're going to kind of flip forward a little bit just to find some of these. The Union had again advanced into Virginia. They had advanced into Virginia in the spring of 1862, had been turned back at the campaign of the 7 Days Battle when General McClellan was in charge of the Union Army of the Potomac against ultimately General Lee, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. Fredericksburg, General Ambrose is now in control of the Union Army of the Potomac, and yes, General Burnside, that's where the name comes from. Those are sideburns. Those are some serious sideburns. So that's where the name comes from. Burnside firmly believed that he was not capable of commanding the army. He set about on December 13th proving that to be exactly correct. So he was right about that particular part of it. He really did not believe he was fit for command, but it devolved on him after General McClellan was relieved of duty. On December 13th, 1862, the Confederates were entrenched on a little hill, not a little hill, a fairly significant hill called Marie's Heights outside of Fredericksburg, Virginia. How many people have been to Fredericksburg? See, a few people have been there. Looks a little different today. The development has gone right up almost to the base of Marie's Heights, but back then it was a huge plain in front, wide open space where the Union troops attacked against entrenched positions. 106,000 Union troops went against Marie's Heights and made the assault. 12,700 were killed or wounded. Confederates less than half of that. Now what happened was some interesting, again, the bodies laid there for a while. One of the units that supposedly entered into this was a group called the Irish Brigade. I'm of Irish-American heritage, so they're of particular interest to me as well. Irish Brigade advanced against Marie's Heights as well. Some of these bodies laid out there overnight. December in Virginia, pretty cold. They couldn't get to them because they were in between the lines. Sergeant Richard Kirkland, 2nd South Carolina, decided, as the story goes, he heard the men moaning, crying out, screaming for water, screaming for help, screaming for medical help. He decided, he went to his commanding officers who said, let me just jump over the wall. Nope, you can't do it, you can't do it. Finally, they relented. And Kirkland said, can you just let me go? And then finally, his officers, all right, fine, you can go. And Kirkland said, can I take kind of a white flag to show that I'm not a combatant? They went, no, you have to go over yourself. So he agreed to do it. Kirkland went back, as the story goes, and ministered to many Union troops laying in front of that position there. This is down at Fredericksburg. It commemorates that. He's known as the Angel of Marie's Heights, Sergeant Richard Kirkland. A similar, almost identical statue is outside the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg. So you may have gone up there and you may have seen that as well. Kirkland continued to fight in 2nd South Carolina. He was at Gettysburg with the unit. The unit was then sent west. When I say west, I don't mean to California. Everything west of Ohio was considered to be the Western campaign in the American Civil War. Kirkland did not survive the war. Kirkland was killed in September of 1863 at the Battle of Chickamauga, which is right on the border of Georgia and Tennessee. Now, the interesting thing is there's still ongoing controversy to this day whether Kirkland actually did it, because there are certain people who note that someone else did it. In certain other cases, what are called official records, there's no mention of Kirkland. One of his commanders didn't mention him in his after-action report. So the question is, did Kirkland really do it? And the answer is, we really don't know. Kirkland did not survive the war, as I mentioned, but I bring it up for this point. This incident has been celebrated for a long, long time. And I would argue, as I said, about religious side, Christian charity certainly was in evidence that day, or at least evidenced afterwards, as a way of trying to make sure that we can heal the country. So whether or not it's true or not certainly still plays into trying to do reconciliation with the country. Next, Vicksburg, Mississippi, April 16, 1863. Vicksburg played into my book. I found some of this when I was looking at this. Let me give you a real quick. This is the campaign for Vicksburg. I know those of you who aren't really big into Civil War probably hate these maps, which show all kinds of red and blue lines everywhere. But bottom line is, see if, oh, this does work. That's wonderful. So, 1863, General Ulysses Grant, who was commanding the Western troops there, decided, hey, we've got to take this city of Vicksburg. Any of you ever been to Vicksburg? Vicksburg is a city that sits way up on top of the hill that overlooks the Mississippi River. River commerce could not go up and down the river because the guns of Vicksburg controlled it. Arguably, Vicksburg was probably the most important campaign of the Civil War, outlasting even Gettysburg, because of the need for river commerce here. So here's Vicksburg. In late 1862, Grant decides, I'm going to go take Vicksburg. This is after the battles of Shiloh, et cetera, and some other things that the Union was involved in. So he advances, he sends General Sherman, who was with him, down here. There's a battle here in December of 1862. Sherman is repulsed because Grant's supposed to be coming down this way to assist. Grant is cut off from his supply lines by an attack by Confederate cavalry, never comes down. Unfortunately, General Sherman never quite got that message, so he attacked anyway and was repulsed. 1863, Grant brings the rest of his men down here. He camps on this side of the river. He can't get across. Mississippi's a pretty big river, makes it kind of difficult. And so he tries things like, if you notice here, the river bends. He tries to cut a canal across here. That didn't work too well. He tried canals around here because you can only get at Vicksburg from this direction. The rest of it is swampy, very difficult to maneuver in. So Grant's thinking, what do I do? So April of 1863, March and April of 1863 have been described as the Valley Forge for Grant's army. Men were dying by the hundreds. They were buried on top of these levees that overlooked the swamp. So Grant decides he's got to do something. What does he have to do? He's somehow got to get down here because he has to get below the guns, but if you try and sail through those things, you're going to get pulverized. So Grant marches his men all the way down the river on the Louisiana side, and he brings them over to here. So what happens next? What happens next is he has the Navy that's going to come out, David Porter, and he's going to take his guns and he's going to sail his ships underneath the Vicksburg defenses. And this is a picture of what it looked like. This is Porter's fleet running the Vicksburg guns. A tremendous achievement that no one probably, has anyone heard of the Vicksburg, running the Vicksburg? He took 8 gunboats and 3 transports. He piled them with hay to protect his guns from being sunk. One was lost. The rest of them got down. The Confederates were unfortunately at a party in Vicksburg that night, so the reaction was a little bit delayed. Although they did fire 500 artillery shells at the small flotilla that went down there. Again, only one was sunk. One of the things I found in the collection that I bought, the woman, Jenny Lindsay here, her father was a state senator from Peoria during the war who was visiting the Union Army with the governor of Illinois at the time and actually witnessed this incident from General Grant's headquarters ship and watched this with General Grant. And he described it, and I had never seen it, of course, because it was in this cabin on a lake in Wisconsin where all these letters were found. But Senator Lindsay writes about this event. No light flashed from transporter steamer with the upper decks but faintly outlined, looking like phantom boats floating upon some dark, mysterious sea. Soon, as if by magic touch, the whole 8 miles of batteries sprang into lurid flames, flooding hill, city, and river and forest with the brilliant light of the noonday sun. The crews working the guns looked like, in his words, hundreds of weird beings moved to and fro all along the shore with torches in their hands as if ministering to the wrath of the infernal. They succeeded in landing men down here. They brought the gunboats down, and they crossed over here, and that was the end of Vicksburg. And arguably, because it surrendered on July 4th, 1863, the day after Picketts Charge, when the Battle of Gettysburg ended, two tremendously significant victories. But again, everyone focuses on the Battle of Gettysburg without realizing Vicksburg was as important, or perhaps in many cases for some, even more important because of what it did here. The Wilderness, Virginia, really ugly looking place. And if you've ever been through there, I have been. It is not a nice place at all. 1864, Grant leaves out in Vicksburg. Has been tremendously successful. Many of you know this. Lincoln says, bringing him east. And there's the old story that may or may not be true about somebody saying, but he's a drunk. He drinks whiskey. And Lincoln's offer was, well, get a case of whatever he's drinking to every other general because this guy wins. So the Wilderness, May 7, 1864, Grant decides to go after Lee. He advances against him. He winds up after May 4th when he crosses the Rappahannock River to go against General Lee and the army. He caught up. So Lee catches up with Grant in an area known as the Wilderness. Something happened to those. Oh, there it is. That's the Wilderness. Not a great place to fight. That's what it looked like back then. Still looks that way today. Lee decided to attack him in there. Tremendous fight in there. At times, the underbrush caught fire and burned wounded men to death. Having the Union advantage of men and artillery became irrelevant because they couldn't maneuver. Drives Grant backwards, pushes him back a bit. Grant decides to disengage again. But unlike other years, things were different. 1861, 1862, 1863, the Union Army would move south along the peninsula. They'd move south against Fredericksburg. They'd move south. They'd be defeated, and they'd retire to Washington. And so there's this great story for those of you who have ever read Bruce Catton. People always say, well, what should I read about the Civil War? If you want to really get an idea and a kind of an introductory, it's not a lot of, I shouldn't say he doesn't go into detail because he does, but he's a great writer. He's won the Pulitzer Prize. Bruce Catton's book has this tremendous description of what happened the night of May 7, 1864. The Union Army pulls back, leaves, and begins to go down a road. Looks like this, maybe even this road. And so what happened is the Union Army assumed this was just like all the other years and all the other campaigns and all the other generals. We're going back. We're going to start all over again, all that wasted life, and now we're going to go back and we're back to square one. But as they started a night march and it was dark out and they're going, all of a sudden they get to a point and they hear hooves behind them. It turns out it's Grant and his staff riding with them. And all of a sudden they get to a fork and they realize they're taking the fork south. Not north. They're not going back. They're continuing. Suddenly there was this tremendous cheer, despite the fact that hundreds and hundreds of men had been killed, thousands wounded. There was this realization that things were different. They had somebody who was different now, who was going to see this through to the end. So a tremendous cheer after 3 years of not, in their view, not accomplishing anything other than defensive at Antietam, at Gettysburg. Now things were different. They finally had somebody who was going to change the war for them. So you can imagine what this meant for the enthusiasm of the men and how they felt about all these things. So changed the perspective of the Union Army simply by going south instead of north. Spotsylvania. Talk quickly about this because I know we're running out of time. Spotsylvania Courthouse, there was a fight at something called the Muleshoe. There was a salient, which is a kind of a extension of the line that was part of the Spotsylvania Courthouse. This was after Grant continued to move and Lee tried to continue to counter him. Situation where the Union attacked that Muleshoe, the salient, and punctured that. And Lee, General Lee, who was kind of at the base of that salient, at the bottom of the thumb, so to speak, saw the Union pierce his line and knew that things were desperate. It was desperate times for his army. So Lee mounts up, he mounts up on Traveler, his horse, and he's going to lead his army against the Union troops that are flooding into the Muleshoe. And his men saw what was happening. And to me, this kind of evokes the honor thy father side, because what happened is the men saw that Lee had planned on leading them in against, and they, in their view, would be almost certain death for Robert E. Lee. The men of a Georgia brigade gathered around Lee's horse. They grabbed the reins, they grabbed the saddle, they brushed up against the flanks of the horse, and they pressed him backwards, all shouting at the same time, General Lee to the rear, General Lee to the rear. That was the respect that they had for him to make sure that he was not in danger. They pressed him back and they assured him that they would push back, and they did. And so they kept the line in. So again, talk a lot about the religious side of this. To me, that was the honor thy father side of that after they stabilized the line. Petersburg, Virginia. Very interesting perspective. How many of you have heard of the crater at Petersburg? See a couple of hands up. This is, again, continuing the same campaign. 1864 was just one grueling battle after another. Thousands and thousands of men dying. Grant lost something like 5,000 men in 15 minutes at Cold Harbor, which we'll not talk about. But after Petersburg, Grant and his men, certainly his commanders, missed a chance to take Petersburg, an important rail center, which is south of Richmond. So he decided he wanted to head around Grant's flank and hoped to take Petersburg. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. They missed that chance. Settled into a long siege of the area of Petersburg. The commander of the 48th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment, so obviously they're from Pennsylvania, coal miners from the northeast part of Pennsylvania, had a great idea. Hey, we're all coal miners. What if we dig this tunnel underneath the Confederate line and blow it up? They took it and they went, what are you, nuts? That can't work. Lo and behold, they gave them the permission to do it anyway because it was a heck of a lot better than a prolonged siege. So on June 25th, 1864, they started that, completed it on July 23rd. The shaft ran 511 feet from the Union lines under the Confederate lines. 20 feet under the line. The Confederates knew something was up. They were probing because these guys are up to something. These guys are up to something. 2 lateral lines that ran. Once they hit the main Confederate line, they ran it down this way and this way 75 feet. So it wouldn't just be one point. So they ran it all the way out. 8,000 pounds of black powder were placed in the tunnel. On July 30th at 3:30 a.m., the fuse was set. It burned out at the splice, so somebody had to run in, resplice it, and reset the fuse. But these guys were miners. They knew what they were doing, so it was all good. Two men had to crawl in and resplice it. At 4:45, it exploded. It worked tremendously. It worked exactly as they thought that it would. Created a crater 170 feet long, 60 to 80 feet wide, 30 feet deep. 278 Confederates were killed or wounded in the blast. What happened, though, was this. The men that were picked to lead this, first off, the commanding generals, including Burnside, who reintroduces himself into the story here, wanted to send a unit of black troops in, the first ones. At this point, black troops were now part of the Union Army as one of the lesser known pieces of the Emancipation Proclamation. So they said, no, you can't do that, because if they get chewed up, if they get slaughtered, it's going to look bad politically for us, so send in the troops you otherwise would. So they sent in some other troops, and those commanders, to be blunt, did not perform well. In fact, the rumor is that at least one, perhaps two of them, including one from another Pennsylvania unit, were back in their tent having a little bit of the whiskey that Grant supposedly liked so much. So they sent these guys in. It worked. The trouble is, the Union troops came in, they got stuck in the bottom, and they just kind of like clumped there. Had they spread out, had they done everything, this could have worked, this could have ended the war a year early. This is what you see afterwards. This is what the crater looked like. You can see massive blast, either side deep. You could see how it just shattered the Confederate line. At the top of the print here, you can see the Confederates charging back. The Union is now falling back, and they're retreating because they've lost their chance. What happened was, unfortunately, tragically, criminally, many of the black troops who were committed in the second wave, the Confederates would not take them prisoner. They simply murdered them, because when they saw that there were black troops fighting against the Confederacy. So again, a lot of people don't know, but clearly a dramatic moment when you take and you blow up something like this. It actually worked. Unfortunately, did not work well, and the war continued for another entire year, unfortunately. Anybody ever hear of, I know we're running short on time, the Picketts Charge of the West? Anybody ever hear of that? Again, same. So here's a picture of Patrick Claiborne. Anyway, what happened? All of you familiar with Sherman? He captured Atlanta, and then he decided he's going to go all the way to the sea. Well, what happened is there was a guy named John Bell Hood. If you watched the Gettysburg movie, Hood was the guy who attacked on the second day, lost an arm, all that stuff. He's now fighting out west against Sherman. He lost to Sherman. Sherman takes Atlanta, so Hood starts harassing him, trying to figure out what he's going to do next. So he tries to draw Sherman out of Atlanta by moving further north in Georgia. Sherman tracks him for a little while and then basically says, the heck with this. He said, you guys go handle him. I'm going to Savannah. So he turns it over to another guy, General George Thomas, to take care of Hood. Hood goes all the way up through Georgia, advances into Tennessee, again, trying to draw Sherman back out unsuccessfully, but he's now fighting against others. Goes all the way up to just south of Nashville, Tennessee. On November 30, 1864, Hood's got about 38,000 men at this point in his army. He goes up against an entrenched position. One of the leaders is a guy named Patrick Claiborne. Claiborne is a Irishman born in Cork County who's leading most of the advanced elements of the Confederate troops that day. Claiborne attacks. This is what it looks like. So there were, out of Hood's 38,000 men, 27,000 charged across 2 miles of open field. The reason it's called Picketts Charge of the West is Picketts Charge had about 13,000 men that charged across the field between 3/4 of a mile and a mile. Everybody knows Picketts Charge, but nobody knows about a more significant charge that happened in the West that had twice as many men over twice as long of a field. What happened at the end? 6,000 Confederates were casualties, including General Patrick Claiborne. Now, Claiborne, interestingly, just a short time before that, had said that he wanted to put blacks into the Confederate Army. That obviously did not happen, but interestingly, he had proposed that. Claiborne is dead. 5 Confederate generals are killed in that battle. 5 Confederate generals. At least 4 of the 5 are laid out on this porch called Carnton, which is in Franklin. At least 4 of the 5. There's some question whether the 5th was actually there. I've been through the house. House is still there. So, again, no one knows about the Picketts Charge of the West, which is always kind of interesting. Really quickly, I know we're running out of time. I'm going to flip through this one. This is one of my favorite ones because May 24th, 1865, end of the war. We have a huge parade for Union soldiers. May 23rd, the Eastern troops go in. Why did they split them? Because the Western troops went through on May 24th. Why? Weren't that there too many? They hated each other. They were brawling in the bars in Washington. They had to separate them on different sides of the Potomac before the Union troops here killed each other. The Eastern and Western troops hated each other. So what happened is Sherman and his men are going to march on May 24th. Now the backstory is Sherman had accepted the surrender of the armies he was fighting against, Joseph Johnston in North Carolina, a few days, or actually a couple of weeks before that. Sherman wound up, without getting into details, giving the Confederates even more lenient terms than Lee got at Appomattox. Well, the political folks in Washington went nuts, particularly Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, who through various channels hinted that Sherman may be guilty of treason. Sherman heard this and was quite incensed to the fact that he thought maybe his guys would march into Washington and root the whole place out and wipe everybody out. This is a picture of the parade that day. Now, Sherman had said to his generals had come to him and said, hey, General Sherman, our guys look really raggedy. Can we get new shoes for these guys and maybe some new pants so they don't look, he goes, nope, no. I want the people to see how these guys marched up through the Carolinas and Virginia and came back here. So they at least put the guys without shoes and holes in the seat of their pants in the middle of the line so it didn't look too bad. This is more the cavalry. And so what happened was they paraded up here, and Sherman, if you've ever read Sherman's memoirs, this is the part that gets me. Sherman has gone through so many things in his career, and he is at the head of his men on this day. And he was worried that because of all that had happened and the fact that the politicians were attacking him, that his men were going to riot in the streets. So if you're ever gone down here, coming from the Capitol and you're ascending the hill to the Treasury building, which is still there, he was worried that literally they were going to riot in the streets, plunder the stores, etc. And he writes, as he ascended the hill towards the Treasury building, he heard a tremendous roar. He thought his men might have broken ranks and were now just pillaging the entire District of Columbia at this point. But then he turned and he saw what he would describe as, quote, the proudest moment in his life. 65,000 men were behind him. And according to what Sherman said, the sight was simply magnificent. The glittering muskets looked like a solid mass of steel moving with the regularity of a pendulum. Now, after he got off of that, that's when the real fun started, because Sherman got up on the reviewing stand, shook President Johnson's hand, shook the hand of General Ulysses Grant. Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, walked up to him like this. Sherman looked at his hand, turned, and walked away. So politics always works from that perspective. It is now, I know it's 1:30, so I'm happy to I know we're out of time for questions. I'm more than pleased to hang around for a few minutes and back. As I mentioned, I do have some books there. We can sell them, and if you're interested. So anyway, thank you for your attention. I look forward to talking to you afterwards.